are starting to join. How much longer should we wait? I really do want to begin. Shall we start? Yes, let's begin, Marcela.
Quiero darles la
I
bienvenida
would like to welcome everyone to the launch of our document drafted together with UNICEF regarding education in the context of the pandemic. This document is part of a series of documents on policies that we've been providing the public with on topics which are relevant currently. And we have a wonderful group. They will open the session, and we will have our regional director from UNDP, Felipe López Calva, opening remarks, and the director of Unicef, Youssouf Abdel-Jelil. He is the director for Latin America. He will also speak initially, and then we'll discuss the messaging of this document. And the professor from the Universidad de los Andes will discuss that, and all the great experts here in education from the region. Emiliana Vegas, who is the co-director of education and is a researcher of that institution. Miguel Urquiola, who is the director of the Colombia University, and Jaime Saavedra, who is the director of the World Bank in the region of Latin America. Wonderful experts who have worked so hard for so long. Felipe, the floor is open to you. Thank you, Marcela. I would like to take advantage to say that we have translation in English. The whole session will be in Spanish, and there is a button for translation at the bottom if you want to hear it in English. Thank you, Marcela. Thank you, everyone. And I would just like to cover 3 points before we give way to the panel. 3 brief topics. First, I would like to thank UNICEF greatly, and Youssouf, who has been a wonderful regional director, Pepe as well, and he is in a transition of leadership, and thank you for your trust in us. We've coordinated jointly, and we will continue to do so. Thank you on behalf of UNDP, and thank you for the enormous interest that this panel has brought up or driven. Really, it has only been because of the experts here. Thank you, Jaime, Miguel, Sandra, thank you as well for your work to produce this paper. And the third point is, as you know, this is a paper which is a part of the series of documents that we have launched in response to COVID under the coordination of the regional director, Marcela Melendez. They have been received with great success, hundreds of downloads, and we will publish this in 2 volumes. We will announce that in the selection of the papers that will be published. Regarding education, this has an impact on productivity on a long term. Its impact on inequality, we're seeing that incredible impact. We're seeing huge impacts on in the crisis now that we're seeing in education and inequalities that we'll face in years to follow. And resilience as well. It has a huge impact on human health and mental health and children, adolescents and adults. It's such a central topic. It's so important to discuss this topic as well. And now I open the floor to Marcela and then Youssouf's talk. Thank you to everyone on the panel for being part of this conversation. Thank you, Felipe and Youssouf. Thank you. Yes, as Felipe mentioned, I'm Youssouf Abdel-Jelil, and I'm Pepe to you. And you have to put up with my Spanish, but thank you all for being here and for being allies in this wonderful and important event. It's a true honor for me to be part of this distinguished panel of colleagues and other people from UNDP, the World Bank, academia. I would also like to welcome Sandra Garcia, an expert panelist, Liliana Vegas as well, Jaime Saavedra, Miguel Urquiola, and the distinguished moderator, Marcela Melendez. I would like to thank Luis Felipe López Calva, who is a friend of UNICEF, who has always acknowledged the importance of the collaboration between our organizations with the joint goals. We are here today, and we would like to thank Luis Felipe for inviting us to be part of the series of documents regarding policies facing COVID-19 and the articles within the series that will highlight the policies focused on complying with the rights of children and the post scenario or with COVID, I would say. And all of this has been done with the leadership of our global and regional directors at UNDP and UNICEF, who are betting on a policy of impact on a great scale, specifically on in a region like ours that will certainly continue to battle with the consequences of COVID-19. I will be brief and give a few words regarding the Sustainable Development Goals. In this framework, I would like to highlight the fact that all of children and adolescents have the right to have an inclusive and quality education independently from their social condition or where they live or their family's economic standing. This gives them not only educational opportunities, but it also translates into the results of learning. Before COVID-19, the region of Latin America and the Caribbean faced great challenges related to equal quality education. And it's evident that these challenges have been exacerbated by the impact of COVID-19. And as the General Secretary of the UN has qualified this as a generational catastrophe when referring to the effects of the pandemic on students, since the closing of schools on the long term will have incalculable uh, impacts that will affect progress that we've seen in prior years and exacerbating the inequality. In closing, I would like to say that it is urgent to plan school openings and using all of the health measures necessary and safeguard uh, the health of our children, as well as the interruption of essential services such as food, nutrition, detection of violence and maltreatment, and protecting childhood. And we need to contribute with services that will benefit children, boys, girls, and adolescents. This crisis is an opportunity to rebuild an inclusive educational system that will close gaps and help us maximize the potential of our children and adolescents in the region. Thank you all for your commitment and contribution in this space. Thank you. Thank you, Youssouf. And now we want to ask Sandra Garcia to share her screen. We have 20 minutes for Sandra to give us uh, a rundown on the progress here. Can you see my screen? Well, first I would like to thank UNDP and UNICEF for having commissioned this study and thank Marcela for her support at this time in this process, and also greet and welcome all of the panelists. It's really a luxury to have you with us. This map basically and I'm sharing it on behalf of UNICEF. This shows the dramatic and catastrophic situation that we are facing currently. 138 million students in Latin America and the Caribbean will complete or will be about to complete in October 7 months of closed schools. We only have a few countries with open schools, 8 of them, and 6 countries where it's a partial reopening, like in Brazil and Colombia, and they're just beginning to reopen. And most countries have an school closures on a national level. This obviously shows several dimensions of impact. One of them that I would like to highlight is from a study by the World Bank, where they simulated the loss of learning on a global scale. And in Latin America, we can see this study with three scenarios. One, which is the most optimistic scenario, the closure of schools during 3 months, an intermediate scenario of schools closed during 5 months, and the most pessimistic, a closure of 7 months, which is the situation we're facing now. This is very severe. Before the pandemic, 53% approximately of our students were under the normal reading standards. And the projection of the World Bank is that it will grow to 68. So there's going to be a 28% uh, raise of students who will be under the basic reading standards. And this will show the significant impact that school closures are having on education and, of course, on their emotional growth for children in the region. Before COVID, the region was already facing incredible challenges. One was the poverty in learning. The It shows how before the pandemic, 50% of poverty in learning, and this percentage shows great gaps in coverage and prevalence in homes with higher level of dropouts and less achievements in learning, and also gaps in the natural resources for learning. We're seeing in the region different situations due to the urban spaces of where the homes are located and access to connectivity, spaces at home for learning, the support that children and adolescents are receiving by their parents in order to study, and obviously this connectivity issue to devices. I'm sharing a few of the graphs, but if you look at the document, you'll be able to see more data. This shows data of homes with just one computer. And here we see countries that have reports on this data. And when we're looking at the average, and here more, almost 100% of students of 15 years old have access to one computer, and less than 20% of students in the inferior quintile have access to a device. So here we're seeing the gaps in resources in order to continue with learning processes and the impact in the region. What are the potential impacts of the crisis in the educational system? We're seeing impacts on different levels. The first one is, of course, the one in students, the loss of learning. Pepe mentioned that some of the great impacts are on mental health. We're seeing how in the region we're seeing more anxiety, stress in children and adolescents, and due to past emergencies, we're seeing that this can become very severe. We're also seeing physical health being impacted by maltreatment, physical aggression, and higher rates of pregnancy. We're also seeing a drop in nutrition because there's food insecurity due to school closures and higher risk of dropout. We're also seeing the impact, the economic impact on families, there is a huge loss of income, and both adolescents and their families as well decide to stop school altogether. This can also lead to chronic stress, consequences in cognitive development and emotional development in children and adolescents, as well as parental practices. And this also raises an alert in the region. The gaps that we were seeing pre-COVID can be exacerbated if actions are not taken in a timely fashion. And we're also seeing an optimistic view of improving this if we can focus on it as a region. It's important to acknowledge the fact that countries in the region have implemented emergency strategies once the health emergency was established, and countries have established different digital platforms, remote learning systems, complementing them with the use of technology for students who don't have access to computers, for instance, even through WhatsApp and text messages. Many countries have also implemented emotional support strategies through guidelines for teachers and parents, and there have also been efforts to support food programs in several of these countries. However, many of these strategies have certain limitations. Firstly, many of these strategies were implemented as emergency measures. I don't think anyone imagined that this would last for so many months. And secondly, as I mentioned previously, these strategies don't always reach everyone equally. And the effectiveness depends on many of the resources that students have access to, and the deficiency in coverage for remote learning added to the gaps that we had pre-COVID imply an imminent risk in expanding our coverage for these educational gaps in the region. We are trying to close gaps and be able to take this jump to improve the quality of education in Latin America and the Caribbean. That's what I want to share for the rest of this presentation. The proposal of a pathway that sees the impact on the region, I'm trying to focus on the main points that we need to consider. And I believe it will be really wonderful to complement this with all the ideas that the other panelists have brought forth. And the idea here is to reopen with urgency, understanding that not all countries will be able to open their schools immediately. It will depend greatly on the conditions of each of the countries, but it's important to clearly guideline in a rigorous fashion the reopening of schools and also establish the requirements for schools in order to have safe reopenings. We have several documents by UNICEF, UNESCO, where there are several conditions that need to be met for reopening, social distancing, physical space, distance, minimum distance between teachers and students, and mechanisms and rules that need to be followed. All of these rules, of course, will depend on the infrastructure. And if schools don't have the proper infrastructure to include 100% of the students under the physical distancing, then it will have to be prioritized by age groups and grades or perhaps shifts. And this will be the second point regarding the organization of educational services. The second point is hygiene and health. One of the main points here is hand washing. Water needs to be available in schools, and the criteria for reopening and defining when a school will be reopened or when it should close down. And the decision will always depend on each country, even on a regional level and even city level or location, and the capability that that school in specific has for reopening. And these conditions need to be met, and the educational services need to be developed according to context. In order to do so, different types of schools need to be looked at. First, we should look at the capacity, hand washing, what they can offer, and then the epidemiological conditions. Some will be very favorable because in some areas the rates of contagion are very low, and in others it will not be favorable. So I'm going to highlight two different types of school. One where schools have a high level of capacity to reopen immediately, on-site education or a hybrid education. And this would be perhaps in a coordinated fashion if 100% of students can't be in the infrastructure at the same time. But then there are other schools that are in a critical situation that have very low capacity of reopening and also are facing situations that are not very favorable in regards to contagion. The education in a remote way will be priority for these schools. And communication here is a very important factor. Reopening needs to have a strong method of communication so both parents and teachers have a way to trust the systems for reopening. In other words, we can't pressure teachers at high risk to come back into schools. We also have to enable the basic health conditions. There will be a bottleneck for reopening. We will have to hire and trust new teachers or provisional teachers in order to comply with the human capital that will be required. Another point which has to do with learning is the focus on the purpose of school. As I mentioned previously, a loss of learning is forecasted at a very high level. We need to be able to recover and remediate this loss and plan along with schools to have measures and mechanisms to measure learning. And we can use traditional methods such as personalized tutoring, etc. And then be able to ensure schooling for all students. We're seeing a massive dropout rates for next year. We have to protect those students, looking at the measuring system of countries themselves or the communities themselves to measure the level of permanence of students and look at the different levels of economic resources that students have so they can continue studying. And another point which has to do with learning is to be able to design bimodal or dual modal learning schemes. Many of the students will not be in school 100% of the time as they were pre-pandemic. So new bimodal learning schemes, both on-site and off-site, will be very important. On a short term, we need to create an educational package for all students, and this package should have three main factors. First, quality content. Second, feedback with the teacher and interaction with the teachers. And third, materials, educational materials. They may be offered with or without technology, depending on the level of technology available. I'm just giving an example here. It's laid out within the document. We could have a low tech package. In other words, materials, guidelines, guidebooks, and printed material, or high level packages with virtual classrooms, the use of computers and connectivity. What we do require is to design these packages depending on the technology available on the short term, and of course consolidate high level content. And here I'm taking advantage of the resources that are already available that have been curated by the World Bank, UNESCO, and others, so that countries can take advantage of them. They're both in English and in Spanish, and also ensure that all students have access to some form of communication with their teachers where there is no connectivity option via internet. Other forms of connection should be used. In order to reach this, we will have to strengthen training and technical assistance to teachers, as well as support for families. In the document that has been laid out, and also taking advantage or leveraging the resources that we have with UNESCO and other organizations, another element here is to support and maintain the programs in schools that also includes nutrition in school, both whether the school is open or not, and also follow up on the students in their homes to make sure that the children are safe in their environments, and also continue with protection and prevention measures. The sexual health programs and prevention of substance use have been stopped, and these need to continue. And the fourth point in this pathway, as I mentioned initially, is to ensure the emotional well-being of the educational community. We have several points here. Continue the guidance for families with self-care strategies to support their children if they're going through emotional upheavals. And there are many resources by different countries that have been built during the emergencies. And the second point is support schools so that they have strategies that can incorporate curriculums that promote social emotional well-being and skills to also support the well-being of teachers. We also have financing and coordination. I think it's very important to lay out the message of how to protect budgeting in education and also see these budgets grow. Otherwise, the development of our human capital will be affected on a long term, and then many of these interventions will need uh, drinkable water, communications. So we need to have intersectorial working groups where support will be fundamental, and find partnerships, both public and private, to establish know-hows from the experts and institutions to also expand on the staffing that's needed. We see several countries in the region that are more advanced. Some have developed technology, content, and strategies that can be shared as a region, so we can strengthen those and use those together. We also need to manage the emergency. This can be an advantage for the region to ensure education for all, independently from where a person is born or their economic level. One is to use technology and digital coverages and ensure that coverage. Second, educational models that are focused on learning, so that all the tech development here is well focused on how to integrate processes with learning, and also consolidate a high level of teachers so that these strategic investments can be focused on the development of these teachers. I would also like to focus on how we want to put focus on well-being for children and adolescents to guarantee their cognitive and emotional development. I think a whole generation is at risk. So we need to place significant efforts on preventing irreparable damage for this generation. Thank you. And thank you, Sandra, for keeping to time. Now we would like to invite Jaime Saavedra, the Global Director of Education for the World Bank, so that he can mention what messages can be highlighted. Thank you, Jaime. Welcome to the conversation. Hello, can you hear me? Perfectly. Thank you, Marcela. And thank you, Luis Felipe and Pepe. I love his nickname. A person from the Middle East speaking Spanish with a Spanish accent. Anyway, thank you so much for this invitation. The document is wonderful, but I love the presentation because within the 20 minutes allotted, Sandra was able to lay out the challenges we're facing as a region, and somehow we're also seeing a link to other challenges in the world. We're seeing this in Latin America, some countries who are poorer than others. So I think there is not much to add, really. It's very comprehensive. I like to see that example of the different types of countries, the different pillars as well of education, as Sandra mentioned. And this is a very useful guide for the region. I would like to just highlight 3 points. One, and Sandra mentioned this at the beginning of the conversation, the objectives. We're calculating huge impact on education and learning and the growth of learning poverty. And this increase of learning poverty is seen around the world, really, but towards the South and Latin America, we're seeing higher impacts than in other regions. Effectively, yes. We had 3 scenarios for this calculation, but very quickly we moved to the most pessimistic scenario. Firstly, due to the extension of these closures, of school closures, and in Latin America, there are very few countries that are opening: Cuba, Nicaragua, Uruguay, and the rest are basically closed. There's reopening in Colombia and Brazil, but basically shut down. So the length of this crisis leads us to the worst scenario. And the second point is how much impact we're seeing on learning. We undoubtedly have information regarding the learning programs in the whole region on multiple platforms. And we're seeing the inequality, of course, but we're seeing countries that have revived their educational TV, and that's great, and that will continue. However, what we're seeing is that countries have taken a step further. We're seeing the rating of programs at TV, and knowing that the child is watching TV that perhaps may be educational, but how much are they learning from that? And there's a huge leap from learning to just watching. And we're seeing these different platforms, but we don't know yet, when we come down to it, how effective these platforms will be when compared to the traditional models. We already had several issues with the traditional models. And of course, we know that the crisis has exacerbated that issue, but we don't have a lot of evidence. We have a first study from Belgium where they studied pre and post-pandemic learning skills, and unfortunately it shows the learning gaps, even with all of the efforts in a country like Belgium. So we are not questioning the usefulness of digital education and platforms, but how much learning is actually being done or obtained. And we're looking at Chile, Colombia, and Brazil and other countries. We will see a loss in learning, significant losses. It's wonderful to see all of these efforts, and we've seen them in several countries, but we do have to acknowledge the fact that what kids are going through right now cannot replace the experience they were having previously. And there's a big difference between the wealthier kids that have access online to communication with their teachers, have spaces at home, have a parent who can guide them, than for a poor child on the lower level of income who don't have good connectivity. Many people living in the same home, so it's very difficult for them to have a space, a quiet space for study. So conditions will be very different, and the impact on equality will be quite significant. Ideally, it would be wonderful if this was a crisis that could have a clear end where we say, okay, we had a pandemic that ended, and now we can focus on recovery, but that's unfortunately not the case. And the availability of a vaccine will take time. We still don't have a vaccine for children, and a vaccine for adults may perhaps be ready during the first or second quarter of next year, but that will not be available or launched in all of our countries. So we'd have to think of the fact that we may have to live with this virus, and that's a complex issue that will require maturity by different societies, because the different policies, as Sandra mentioned, the health protocols, sanitation, the different shifts and calendars for schools, curriculums, simplifying curriculums, focusing on different learning methods. We have to focus on all of that. And we also have to have this blended learning system, bimodal or hybrid, which is on-site and remote. This is also a learning process for all of us, a process where we have to implement new policies, and perhaps mistakes will be made, and that will be normal because it's a new educational system altogether. We're really rewriting the system during this time. So we have to take advantage of implementing policies that haven't worked and correcting them. And this flexibility, this capability of being flexible in these educational systems are very important. And then I would like to close by mentioning another topic. What is the lessons learned? What are the lessons learned here during this pandemic? As Sandra mentioned clearly, there is a digital gap. Decades ago, we were talking about the digital gap. Well, we didn't close that gap. And now during this pandemic, we've been caught ill prepared. As you may say, well, knowing that we already had a digital gap, now we are really facing the consequences of not having closed that gap. Things would have been perfect, or maybe not if we had closed that gap, but we would have been better prepared. And it's difficult to close a digital gap. It's not just about a computer, it's about having devices, connectivity, the pricing on internet services, proper software, the purchasing power of software on a higher level, and providing also digital connection and knowledge to teachers. So closing that gap is difficult. Secondly, we're also seeing the issue with teachers. Education is really a social phenomenon. It has to do with interaction. Human interaction is essential. We thought that maybe technology would replace teachers, but that's not the truth of it. We're realizing that our investment needs to be on complementing and harnessing technology to help our teachers and continue and reevaluate the teaching career. We're also seeing that parents are center pieces to education. Some parents had been involved and others weren't, but parents within public policies need to have the proper support so that they can be more effective in supporting the educational process for children. And finally, the fourth lesson is communication methods. TV, radio came back in the region, and this needs to waken up the media. Whether they like it or not, they are fundamental. They are protagonists here in the lives of our children. It's not only the fact that we need more education in TV, but the media needs to take on their strong, powerful role of how they are part of the formation of our children and adolescents. Thank you. Thank you, Jaime. Now, Liliana Vegas, the senior researcher and co-director for the Universal Center of Education. Thank you, Liliana. You have 8 minutes. Thank you, Marcela. Thank you, and Luis Felipe and Pepe, and of course, Sandra, thank you for your presentation. Incredible. I want to say that your report is wonderful, but your presentation was even better. Jaime covered on several of the points I would mention, but I would add a few more things. Pepe mentioned that the crisis is an opportunity to reimagine and rebuild the educational systems in the region to serve all. And I think this is a debt we've had for several years. Those who have followed the turn of the situation of education, we've always been concerned. We've seen the high level of inequality due to wealth gaps in education. So what I would like to leave the audience with is what is happening during school closures is forcing innovation and change that in the past we saw very far off. And sometimes we did want to achieve certain things, but it seemed unobtainable. There are 2 points that I would like to highlight in particularly. One, I think there's a re-evaluation of the role of schools as the learning centers and also a center that offer crucial services for children and adolescents in the region that enable parents and their caregivers to go out and work and continue with their life work balance, but then also the acknowledgement of the impact school has outside of the learning environment. So we have to look at the learning process that we want for our children and that they will be well established, but the expectation is not that they will just get everything in schools or through remote education, but in other educational activities at home, etc. Another important factor, and it's related to the point that Sandra mentioned, the importance of continuing investment in education, especially because sanitation factors and needs are enormous. We are still undergoing a crisis, but education is really a factor of social development. If we don't invest right now in education, we're not only limiting the potential of children and adolescents today, but we're also affecting many adults, their parents and caregivers who can't go out and work because their kids are not going to school, and also other types of jobs that schools provide, both directly and indirectly. Our co-director, Rebecca Winthrop, who worked with me, we really produced a small report published at the beginning of September, where we laid out certain proposals, educational proposals. Post-pandemic, we looked at public education and how it must play out an important role in reconstruction, rebuilding, not only for children and adolescents, but the socioeconomic structures of our countries. We focused on public education because public education has a mandate of serving all and much more inclusive than private education, although we don't want to neglect the fact that there's an important impact in development by private education as well. The second proposal that Sandra highlighted is to focus in a laser focused kind of way in on the nucleus, the students, the educators, and the instructional core, the material. And that's really why many of the efforts to reform education have failed, because they haven't focused on affecting that triangle, how the teacher interacts with content, and as Jaime and Sandra mentioned, the important role of parents in times of pandemic, as well as when students will be able to go back to school. And the third proposal is to take advantage of technology, but acknowledging that technology is a complement for teachers. Alejandro Ganimia, my colleague from the University of New York, and Frederick is who helped me with a research project on how technology can have an effect or an impact on this educational nucleus, and what technology can do to support teachers and professors. And the fourth proposal is to strengthen the role and participation of parents and caregivers between the student and the educational material at home, and also the student with their professors. And as Jaime mentioned, this is a new territory. Although there is empirical evidence and rigorous studies regarding what works in what context, we can't limit to what we're to just this empirical knowledge, but we also have to innovate as we progress. And that's another opportunity to leapfrog in education, especially in regions where for so many years we've seen educational budgets grow, but results in education haven't grown as much. So thank you very much. Thank you, Emiliana. We are getting some questions that we will not be able to answer here during the panel, but we will try and answer them all at the very end, and they will be recorded. I would like to invite the head of university. There's a question for him specifically. How do we introduce flexibility without exacerbating the inequality? Thank you, Miguel. Thank you. I will try and annotate that question. I will start with different comments. I really enjoyed the presentation and the report. Very well done. I would like to focus on 3 points. First, I would like to start with the topic, and I would count myself within that group that thought, well, within 3 to 5 months, this will pass. But now I'm the most pessimist, even more than Jaime. There are treatments and there may be vaccines. And I think on the long term, things are promising, or they're looking up in to get them across our region. I think it could take over 2 years. So perhaps we're talking about 21, 24 more months. And this could be a catastrophe on a generational level. That's one of the topics of how serious this can become. Too, this is what we're seeing, and the risk, as Jaime mentioned, of the virus and the pandemic will not drop to zero at any point, or at a specific time that we can see. Many people will continue being at risk. So this is a serious issue in education, and what we're seeing in many countries around the world, and definitely more in our regions, we're seeing resistance by many teachers to go back to school. There is a high risk. Many of these teachers are older, but in other cases, it's just the fact that people see risk and there's strong resistance or reluctance to going back. We're seeing that more in some countries than others, but I think that this will be an important topic. Many of us are professors in our own way, and I see several colleagues who don't want to come back in my university, and some do. But this is the context in New York, for instance. As Sandra said, that's even on the better side, but there's huge resistance around the globe. And what we have to see is, what are we going to do about it? And how do we start this conversation with governments? I want to say that some governments still have not assumed how serious the situation is, or of course, that's not to generalize everywhere, but I think that many governments need to start bringing the teachers to the conversation, and society as well, to make emphasis on how important this aspect is. Otherwise, it won't be easy to accomplish. And another important thing from the report, such as the practical factors, what can be done if there's still a lot of resistance. One option would be to give out more vouchers, so that, as Emiliana mentioned, the private sector may have the tendency of making schools work again. Those of you who know me, that I know me, don't know that I don't agree with the vouchers 100%, but I think this is a mechanism that should be explored and show the public how this is important. I think this could be a risky policy, and I don't think risky policies should be taken on immediately, but as everyone mentioned, this is a very difficult time. And as Sandra mentioned, the use of bonuses or subsidies for many schools to reopen. And these subsidies should be focused on certain areas, schools in certain areas. For instance, state that this is temporary support, and perhaps for younger teachers who want to go back to the classroom and expose themselves in a way. And then back to the question, there's a statement that I love. Winston Churchill said this after the Second World War. He said, perhaps it will go well for us or it won't. But when people look back on this, they should be able to say this was our glorious hour. And I think the health sector has done that. Doctors, nurses can say this has been the most glorious hour. I don't think educators have reached that point yet. I think every educator needs to question themselves and say, okay, what can I do on the policy side and in my own classroom? Risks will never drop to zero, but I want to say that 2 to 3 years from now, I want to say I'm unashamed of my actions. In this case, of course, we need to have flexible public policies to face the situations, and it will be the same in schools. As Jaime mentioned, we can't be fearful of mistakes. We need to give teachers flexibility, uh, school directors, principals, that flexibility. Something may work in one school that doesn't work in another. And as Jaime mentioned, it can't all just be the same across the board. Thank you, Marcela. Thank you, everyone. And seeing the enormous amount of questions we're getting, and unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time left, but it's been a true pleasure to review this document. It's such an important topic, and I would like to thank all of the participants and our panelists. The documents in both Spanish and English are already published online on our webpage, available to the public, and you can even access it through Luis Felipe López Calva, our director's Twitter. And thank you so much to everyone. I think we will close with that. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your comments and questions. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sandra, Jaime, Miguel, and Emiliana. Thank you, everyone.
Un honor.
Thank you. It's a true honor to have you all. Thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you.